Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for joining me for this IELTS lesson. Today, get ready because we're going to look at the identifying information question type for the IELTS exam. And this is arguably one of the most difficult question types in the exam. It is infamous for confusing students, giving them problems during the exam, and taking up a lot of time. But don't worry, today I'm going to explain what these answer options mean. We're going to look at a step-by-step example, and we're going to leave you with many tips and tricks on how to best approach this question and ultimately succeed. So first off, I would just like to talk about what this question type is about and what it's expecting its test takers to do. First off, this question type is going to test your ability to identify specific information and recognize particular points in the passage. So it's very, very important that you're only answering your questions based on this knowledge that's in the passage. So for example, if you are an expert on William Henry Perkin by chance, and you know all about William Henry Perkin's life, you don't need to use that information. In fact, you mustn't use that information when looking at these questions. You only want to answer these questions based on the information in the passage. This is extremely important. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is that you have three answer options. So you have true, false, and not given. And this not given option is what gives students a lot of problems. The difference between false and not given is where a lot of students make mistakes. And so the first thing we're going to do together is look at three different examples, okay, on what true means, what false means, and when to use not given. Okay, so we'll approach that first. Afterwards, I'll take you on the step-by-step example. Okay, let's get started. Now, before we get into the question, I just want to review a little bit the answer options: true, false, and not given. Because it might seem like a classic true and false question, but that's simply not the case. So I want to just go over each question type. And the first one, true. It says, answer true if the statement agrees with the information. So if a statement is similar to information in the passage, it is not necessarily true. Make sure that you know it has to be 100% true. And since the themes and the information in the IELTS academic exam are factual in nature, always remember that similar does not always equal true. So if it's similar but not exactly the same, the answer is most likely false. Okay, and this is also a common pitfall for students. Don't get confused if the same idea is presented in different words in the passage. So if synonyms are used, for example, then the answer could also still be true, all right? But if the information in the passage contradicts or is the opposite of what is included in one of your questions, the answer is false. Okay? However, if the answer is not given, it means the passage just doesn't contain the information presented in your question, nor does the passage confirm or contradict that information. Okay? So, as a rule of thumb, always think true is 100% the same, not similar. False means that you have found information in the text that contradicts the information in your question. And not given just means that the passage does not contain the information, nor does it contradict the information in your question type. So be aware that you'll have to think of two different points for the not given option. All right, now let's start with number one. And as a rule of thumb, you're always going to want to read your first statement first. I'll talk about this a bit later, but you're going to read the first statement first, scan the text, and then skim for information. So we're using both the scanning and the skimming techniques. I'll talk about this later. We'll just read here. All large chilies grow high off the ground. And right away, you want to pay attention to the wording in your question. And the fact that all is used, which is an absolute term, is a very good clue for us. Okay, so all large chilies grow high off the ground. You want to think about that statement. If by chance in your text you read something that says some large chilies or most large chilies grow high off the ground, this would not be true, because even if it's similar, remember, it's not always true. So in an actual exam, you would want to scan your text for the keywords. So something like chilies and ground, also grow is a good keyword. We've already done this for you because we're just looking at an example here. And so let's go ahead and pay attention to this statement here. It says, the smaller chilies tend to be the hottest. This may reflect the fact that they tend to grow closer to the ground and are therefore more vulnerable to animals. So let's dissect this. This says smaller chilies grow closer to the ground, okay? And this question is saying all large chilies grow high off the ground. So the text is talking about smaller chilies. The question is talking about large chilies. They are not similar, so I couldn't say true because this statement does not confirm number one. So true would not be an option here. The problem is figuring out if this is false or not given. Now, this is where you have to really use your critical thinking skills. This sentence does not contradict the fact that all large chilies grow high off the ground. It doesn't. It also doesn't confirm it. So in that case, not given would be the best option, because perhaps all large chilies grow off the ground. We don't know. And this text doesn't tell us. It also doesn't contradict this statement. So not given is the best option. You might be thinking, well, what if this information is included later throughout the text? And that's an excellent question. Something to keep in mind about the identifying information question type is that questions 99% of the time come in order. All right. I've never seen an identifying information question type that was out of order. So number one, for example, if it was in this paragraph, the following information would more than likely contain number two, number three, and so on and so forth. So you can rest assured that if this paragraph, if this information does not contradict nor confirm this question, the answer is not given. So we can cross off false and we could write not given. All right, let's move on to our next example. All right, so we're back with our second example. Again, we'll look at number one, and it says, the amount of information that can be sent in a given time period is determined with reference to the signal strength and noise level. So we know we're talking about noise, we're looking at information and signal strength. Okay, so this is our question. And again, in the passage up above, we've already highlighted where this information would be found. So let's go ahead and read this blue highlighted sentence together. In particular, noise sets a limit on the rate at which information can pass along communication channels while remaining error-free. So we have already noise and information, okay? This rate depends on the relative strengths of the signal and noise traveling down the communication channel and on its capacity, its bandwidth. So here, the highlighted sentences in this passage, this is what proves that this question statement is true, because the sentences in the passage prove that the amount of information that can be sent in a given time period depends on the relative strengths of the signal and noise traveling down the communication channel. Okay, so in this case, depends on here is basically another way to say determined with. And the signal strength and the noise level are both referenced in this passage, even though it's not the same formatting as the question statement. And this is an excellent example because similar to the other question types that we'll be looking at in this IELTS academic reading adventure, a lot of these statements and a lot of the questions will not be worded the same way in the passage because that would be far too easy. So be on the lookout for synonyms. For example, again, determined with, depends on, very similar. And basically, this passage is saying the question statement in a different way. All right, let's look at our last example. Now, the first example we looked at was not given. The second example we looked at was true. And so we're going to show you an example of how this question statement is false. So again, we'll look at number 1, and it says 30% of deaths in the United States are caused by smoking-related diseases. And here we have a very specific amount. We have 30%. That's also a nice clue. Just like absolute terms that we saw in the first example, all, 30% is very specific and should help us. So if we look up here in our passage, we have highlighted the sentence for you, and let's look at it together. Smoking, it is believed, is responsible for 30% of all deaths from cancer and clearly represents the most important preventable cause of cancer in countries like the United States today. This is a very tricky example, and a common pitfall for students would be to recognize 30%, 30%, United States, and automatically think it's true. And that is incorrect. Okay, so let's look at this a bit more in detail. The question statement is very similar to the passage, but if you look at the highlighted passage here, it says that smoking, it is believed, is responsible for 30% of all deaths. And notice how there's an absolute term, all, in the passage. So you have to be aware of these absolute terms in the passage as well as in the question statements, okay? So the question statement includes 30% of deaths. And the idea is that it's 30% of all deaths. But the statement in the passage, on the other hand, states that smoking is believed to be responsible for only 30% of all deaths from cancer. And this is where it's tricky because people think, well, all is here, and this is talking about 30% of all deaths, so it must be true. But if you keep reading, it's all deaths from cancer, and cancer alone, not all deaths. And so this key detail, this very minute detail, would make this answer false because it is incorrect to say that 30% of deaths in the United States are caused by smoking-related diseases. It's 30% of all deaths from cancer, okay? And so this would be false. I hope those 3 examples helped you understand the differences between true, false, and not given. And now we're going to put those skills to the test with a step-by-step instruction. First, I just want to give you an overview of what we will be looking at and the steps that we'll be taking. So first, we're going to read the first statement and then scan the text. If you remember earlier, I mentioned that the answers are going to come in order. So that's why it's important to start with the first statement because we will more than likely find the answer in the beginning of the text. Now, as we read the first statement and scan the information, we'll have to pay attention to those absolute words. And now, if you remember, in a couple of the examples, we found some absolute words that helped us and allowed us to look for more specific information. Now, these words can include adverbs of frequency or words like all, mainly. These are great words that are usually present in the IELTS exam and more specifically for this question type. So whenever you see these words, they can either help you or confuse you. All right, moving on to our second step. Once we have completed the first statement and scanned, we're going to continue on reading the statements, always scanning, and answering our questions. We want to go in order. However, if you are stumped and there is something that is just very difficult for you, don't freak out. Skip it and move on. Perhaps make a little note in your passage of where you think the answer could be, and then come back to it later. You don't want to get stressed over one difficult question, so just go ahead and move on. All right, now we're going to start with our step-by-step example. We're going to pull everything together. I hope you're ready. Here is our step-by-step example. We have step 1, read the first question. So you always want to take a look at the first sentence. And for us, that first sentence is here on the right-hand side. Now, as you read the first question, it's very helpful if you underline any keywords that you think will help you identify the information in the text. And this will help you prepare your mind. And also, if you underline keywords, these words will be fresh in your memory and you'll be ready to tackle the passage. Now, we'll do all of these together. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Just because I'm taking you through this step-by-step example, let's go through the keywords together, and we'll also include potential synonyms for verbs and adjectives. Now, this is an optional step, but again, like I said, you will most likely see this information presented in a different way in the passage, so it's always helpful to have synonyms and ways to paraphrase information fresh in your mind. Again, it's optional, but we will show you what we came up with after we're done with this step. Okay, so if we read the first sentence, we see Michael Faraday was the first person to recognize Perkins' ability as a student of chemistry. Now, also pay attention to absolute terms, and there is one absolute term here, first. So also ordinal numbers are things to look out for because they're very specific. So I would say that keywords here are Faraday. Perkin is also important because it's a specific name, student, and I would also say chemistry. And again, we said first in the beginning. Think of some synonyms for this. If we look at the phrase again, it says Michael Faraday was the first person to recognize. Here's a verb, recognize. We could think of a different way to say that verb. It could be something like notice or the first person to realize. And if we look at ability, this is another way that we can look at a synonym. I would say aptitude or potential. So Perkins' aptitude as a student or Perkins' potential as a chemistry student. All right, number 2, Michael Faraday suggested Perkins should enroll in the Royal College of Chemistry. So again, keywords, again, Faraday is still important. Enroll, specific verb. Perkin again is important. And Royal College of Chemistry is a specific title, and we can easily scan for that information. And if we look at the verbs again, I see suggested. Another way to say suggested is recommended. It's a very common thing. And then enroll, perhaps another way to say enroll, I would say register, for example. I just cleared my screen so we have a little bit more clarity in working space. So number 3, Perkin employed August Wilhelm Hoffman as his assistant. So again, we have names. Names, I'm just going to do the last name for Hoffman. I won't underline the whole thing. Names are important because they're very specific. And I would also say assistant is a good keyword here. And for a verb, I have employed. So I'm going to think of a synonym. Took on is an excellent synonym for employed. It's also a phrasal verb. And so be on the lookout for phrasal verbs because they're very common in the exam. And think of also another way to say assistant. You could say protege or right-hand man. Okay, these are different ways to say that word. Okay, number 4, I'll just make a little note here of where we are. Perkin was still young when he made the discovery that made him rich and famous. Again, Perkin, and I would say young because we're looking at how old he was, time periods, and discovery. Okay, also famous would probably be a good keyword as well. And then for synonyms, I would say for discovery, another way to say discovery could be a finding, okay, that made him, I would say, brought him fame and riches, something like this. All right, number 5, we're almost done here with our prep work. It says here, the trees from which quinine is derived grow only in South America. Again, you see an absolute term, which we looked at before, only, okay, very important. And then I would highlight this quinine, which is also a specific word, South America, because you're looking at a specific place. And some synonyms here. Another way to say or paraphrase this sentence could be the trees from which quinine comes from. Okay, we're looking at another phrasal verb here for derived. Comes from are specific only to South America, for example. The next phrase we see, Perkin hoped to manufacture a drug from a coal tar waste product. Again, Perkin. And I would say coal tar waste is also a specific type of product. You don't want to underline product because that's quite vague. So coal tar waste is something good that we can look out for and scan in the information presented to us. And manufacture is an excellent word because there are a lot of synonyms we could use for it. We could say produce, for example. That's a very common way to say manufacture, to produce or to create or to make. So you can be on the lookout for those words as well. And then for our last sentence here, we see Perkin was inspired by the discoveries of the famous scientist Louis Pasteur. And so I have Perkin, again, inspired, and this name as well, Pasteur, I would highlight because that is specific and it's different from all of these other names. So when we scan for this specific name, it should lead us to the information to answer this question. Okay, I'm going to clear now and show the keywords just to highlight everything we have done. So we have our absolute words, first and only. We have our keywords pulled out and also synonyms. Now it's interesting here, this note, it's something to keep in mind that the synonyms we've chosen or the synonyms that you may choose may or may not be present in the passage. And that's fine because this preparation work that you're doing and these examples that we're going through not only give you helpful tips and tricks, but they also enlighten your vocabulary and teach you new words. And all in all, these skills are helping you prepare for the exam. So just keep that in mind. The synonyms are an optional step, but it can never hurt you. All right, let's go to our next step, step 2, which is scanning for the answer. So we have our passage on the right-hand side, and we have our questions that we just looked at here, okay? And again, we see true, false, or not given, and it's very important that you write only true, false, and not given on your answer sheet. And let's just review step 2 before we actually get started. Now, remember, it's sequential order. So once we find the first answer, we will be well prepared to go ahead and continue. We'll think about our synonyms, okay, because it's very likely that the statements we see below will not appear word for word in the passage. If that were the case, it would be much too easy for us. Okay, now I'm going to clear our screen and I'm going to make sure that we are ready. We're at the very top of the passage. I'm going to go down here and we're going to look at our questions. So here we're going to look question by question, okay? And just to review, we said the keywords here were Faraday, Perkin, student, and first, which is our interesting key word. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and start scanning the passage. And so right away, I see student here, I see Perkin, and chemistry. So already we have these keywords that were in the statement. And so I'm just going to skim now because I've found the section in the text, which is here. I found the section as to where this answer is most likely hidden. And I'm just going to skim for some information. And right away, just from skimming, I see a teacher who is Thomas Hall. So if we look at this, it says his talent and devotion to the subject were perceived by his teacher, Thomas Hall, who encouraged him to attend a series of lectures given by the eminent scientist Michael Faraday at the Royal Institution. So I see Faraday, who is included here, but we also see Thomas Hall. Now, the fact that this sentence here, his talent and devotion to the subject were perceived by his teacher, Thomas Hall, comes before the Michael Faraday at the Royal Institution, shows us that Thomas Hall was the person who initially recognized Perkin's ability as a student because he encouraged Perkin to attend these lectures. So that would make this number one false, because Michael Faraday, yes, was someone who perhaps had some sort of effect on Perkin's life, but it showed that Thomas Hall encouraged Perkin to go to these lectures. And so it would be false to say that Michael Faraday was the first person to recognize Perkin's ability. And so we would say this is false. And you see right away how this absolute term first showed us easily the answer. So I'll clear our screen here. We will show our first answer, and it is false, okay? And we see exactly here. So Thomas Hall was the first person to recognize Perkin's ability, not Michael Faraday. Therefore, it's false. Good job. Let's go to the next step. And now what we're going to do is read 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And we'll do this together and make notes and then check our answers at the end. Looking at step 3, we see that we've completed our first answer. And this is important because it tells us where we need to begin. So we were right here. Our first answer was in this area. So we'll just have to keep reading on from here and finding our answers in order. Again, like I said earlier, if you're stumped, we'll just go ahead and move on. But it's really helpful to mark the passage a little line or a little dot to think about where the answer could be found. And this will just help us keep everything in order, because we have to remember that these answers will come sequentially. Our first question was answered in this paragraph, so I'm just going to continue on there with my scanning techniques. Okay, and just to review our keywords in number 2, we said Faraday, Perkin, enroll, and Royal College of Chemistry, which was a keyword. And remember, we were thinking of different ways to potentially say the word enroll. Okay, so let's start again and scan. And already, I'm not sure if you've seen it, but I see it. It's the Royal College of Chemistry. So we already see this keyword in the same paragraph, but after the answer to the first question. And so let's go ahead and read. It says here, those speeches fired the young chemist's enthusiasm further, and he later went on to attend the Royal College of Chemistry, which he succeeded in entering in 1853. Okay, then we have some more specific details. Now, it doesn't say that Michael Faraday up here suggested Perkin should enroll in the Royal College of Chemistry. It does mention him, but it doesn't connect these two thoughts. However, keep in mind, it also doesn't contradict the information here. So this passage does not say, Michael Faraday did not tell Perkin to enroll in the Royal College of Chemistry. In fact, he suggested against it. No, that is not included in this passage. So it's definitely not true. It's also definitely not false, because nothing contradicts number 2. So therefore, number 2 would be not given. So I'll make a note that number 2 is not given because the information simply isn't included. Okay, let's go on to number 3. I will scroll down just a little bit to give us the maximum space. All right, so we're going to start again by looking at the keywords. We see Perkin, employed, and remember Hoffman as assistant. We might need to look at a different synonym for the word employed. Okay, and we'll go ahead and start reading and looking for these key words in our paragraph. And right away I see Hoffman and assistant. So I know that the answer might be around here. So let's start reading. I'll just skim. Perkins' scientific gifts soon caught Hoffman's attention. Within 2 years, he became Hoffman's youngest assistant. Here's another absolute word. And not long after that, Perkin made the scientific breakthrough that would bring him both fame and fortune. So we see here that Perkin became Hoffman's youngest assistant. But the statement says Perkin employed Hoffman as his assistant. This is also a classic trick because students will see assistant Hoffman, oh, must be true. But it's actually the opposite. So Perkin was Hoffman's assistant, and this is saying that Hoffman was Perkins' assistant. This is a direct contradiction, making this option clearly false. All right, let's move on. And we'll go down again to number 4. I will just scroll down a bit here. Okay. And I'm going to remind you of the keywords. Perkin was young, the discovery that made him rich and famous. So we're going to be looking most likely for an age or a time period. And again, right away, we see fame and fortune. Okay, so we see that Perkin was a young assistant. Not long after that, Perkin made the scientific breakthrough that would bring him both fame and fortune. So the fact that he was a young assistant and the fact that the passage says not long after that, meaning he was still young, we could say that this is true because Perkin was young when he made the discovery that brought him fame and fortune. And if you remember from our keyword step 1, we did say that fame and fortune could have been good keywords for rich and famous. So this does back up the statement in number 4, and I would say that number 4 is true. Let's move on. We'll scroll down. You see, with the prep and the keywords, it kind of just flies by. All right, the next statement here, I'm going to scroll down and make sure that we have enough space. Okay, so we see number 5, the trees from which quinine is derived grow only in South America. And remember, we had only that absolute key word. Now, just looking here at this paragraph, right away, I see quinine here. I see South America, and this is an excellent area to go ahead and skim. So at the time, quinine was the only viable medical treatment for malaria. Now we see only, but it is not used in the same way that it's used in number 5, so that's something to keep in mind. The drug is derived from the bark of the cinchona tree native to South America. So we see these keywords and we see only, so we have to keep reading because we're not sure if this could be false or not given. So we really need to understand if this tree is only available in South America. And this paragraph doesn't reject or confirm that idea. We know that quinine is from a tree in South America, but we don't know if it's available only in South America. We know that quinine was the only viable medical treatment for malaria, but that doesn't necessarily make this true. Again, it doesn't make it false. There isn't anything in here that says the tree is available or grows in other countries or on other continents. So in that case, this would be not given because we cannot contradict and we cannot prove the question statement based on this information alone. So not given. All right, moving down again to number 6. Our keywords in number 6, again, were Perkin, manufacture, and coal tar waste, which was very specific. And so I'll go down here. And again, just scanning for those keywords. I'm looking here and right away, coal tar waste product. So here we go, it's specific. I'm going to go ahead and scan. I see during his vacation, he spent time in the laboratory. He was attempting to manufacture, okay, there we go, word for word, quinine from another chemical here, an inexpensive and readily available coal tar waste product. So this is actually quite clear, and we're very lucky to get a question like this. So if we look at it again, he was attempting to manufacture quinine from aniline, an inexpensive and readily available coal tar waste product. He hoped to manufacture a drug from a coal tar waste product. Absolutely. It says a drug and quinine, so that's fine. That's a similar way to say this. A drug is not as specific. The passage is more specific, but it is true. So number 6 would be true. And lastly, number 7, we saw Perkin as a keyword, discoveries, and that very specific scientist, Pasteur. So I'm going to go ahead and continue reading. And right away in the same paragraph, I already see the name, Pasteur. So it says, and proving the truth of the famous scientist Louis Pasteur's words, chance favors only the prepared mind. Perkin saw the potential of his unexpected find. And just to make sure, I want to make sure that we don't see Pasteur later on. And this is the only place that he's mentioned. So in the text, it doesn't say that Perkin was inspired. It also doesn't say that Perkin was uninspired from Louis Pasteur. He only proved something from this scientist. And so it doesn't contradict, it doesn't prove it as correct, and therefore number 7 would also be not given, because we cannot prove number 7 is true based on this information in the passage alone. Okay, so I will clear our screen. We have completed all of these questions. And now just to review before we check our answers, we had number 1 as false. We had number 2 as not given. Number 3 as false. Number 4 as true. Number 5 as not given. And here I will just clear our screen so we have more room. And number 6 we had as true. And number 7 was not given. Okay, so I hope you're following along and writing at home, because I'm going to clear our screen once more, and we'll go ahead and show the answers. And if you look, and if you were following along, we got all of them correct. Okay, so we have false, not given, false, true, not given, true, and not given. Remember, on test day, be sure to write out the whole word. So false, not given, true, write out the whole word, very important. And if you scroll down here, it shows you exactly where the answers were found. You see that they were found in order, as is very common in this identifying information question type. And it also gives you some explanations that we went over together. Now you'll notice that the rest of this passage does not contain any answers, and you might be asking why. And keep in mind that when you take the IELTS exam, you'll have 2 or more question types present for a passage. And so it wouldn't be uncommon to have another question type that would focus on this last half of the passage. All right, excellent job. Let's go ahead now and wrap up our lesson and look at key things to do and key things to avoid with the identifying information question type. All right, now just to recap, some things you'll want to do. Do read the first statement, underline your keywords, and scan. Once you've found the information for the first statement and you've found that answer, it will be much easier for you to continue on answering the rest of the questions, because you do need to remember that answers will most likely come in order. Also, do remember the difference between false and not given. We explained this in our initial examples earlier in the video, but if information in the passage contradicts your information question, it's most likely false. If it neither contradicts or proves that information, it's most likely not given. Do make marks in your passage as to where you've found answers, and do skip a question if it's too difficult and go ahead and move on. Try not to waste time with this question type. Lastly, do write only true, false, and not given on your answer sheets. Don't read the passage first. This is very important. We should never do this because we don't want to read blindly, but even more so for this question type, you need to read the statements first. So don't read the passage first. Also, don't forget to scan for your keywords from the statements. The keywords and the optional synonyms are great practice and a great way to help you during the exam. And lastly, don't confuse false and not given. Wow, so we've had quite an adventure today looking at the identifying information